large charter anyway. It's not even clear, no one seems to me can say what constitutes the crisis that calls this management structure into being. You and I were talking earlier in the day, you mentioned that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, though no one planned it, it turned out that it was run, in effect, I gather the Bush role was played by the Attorney General then, the President's brother. So these things get worked out on the spot. But beyond this, Al Haig has quite enough on his plate. He has a constant perennial crisis called the State Department to manage. He's sort of radiated his will through about 1/3 of the 7th floor, would be my guess, and the rest of the department remains an untamed beast, and it's quite enough to keep him busy, I should have thought.
See, Jack,
the argument is that this attention is being taken away from the economic program by preoccupation with the Soviet Union or terrorism or El Salvador. I think the White House in this regard is making a misjudgment. That is, I think that it ill behooves the administration be quite so conspicuously single-minded about the national aquarium and other issues that are not the fundamental problems confronting the country. I think their economic program might stand a better chance if there were a wider range of public preoccupations. Wait, before you accept the moral symmetry between talking to the PLO and talking to the South Africans have the distinction of being a nation, not a terrorist organization.
Of course.
We've talked about this. You've been talking about the crisis. Now, look, this is the second anniversary of 3 Mile Island, which was at the time described as a calamity and a catastrophe and all that. Now we look back and say, what exactly happened? Well, bad things to a utility company's budget and the utility bills of people in central Pennsylvania, but a crisis and calamity it was not. And I do think we tend to go up the ladder of hyperbole pretty fast if we call these spats crises in government. It is. I think the president ought to be encouraged and slightly discouraged. Encouraged on the fact that he has the whip hand on budget cuts because he has the will to veto and he has the constitutional right to veto and he has the votes to sustain a veto. And by making the decision, costly in some ways, to exempt the entitlement programs and focus the budget cutting on appropriated programs, he can enforce his will on this. The Congress, which has to initiate changes in law to change the taxes, has the whip hand there. And I made a little fuss on this show about 2 months ago, whenever it was, that the Democrats didn't really play fair when they did not close the 2-to-1 gap in membership on the House Ways and Means Committee. That matters a lot because with Rostenkowski, who's a tough, intelligent Democratic politician, they're going to serve up something to the president that's not appetizing. Playing with fire in the House, though, because at the moment Rostenkowski may be the Polish crisis confronting Ronald Reagan, but in fact, if the House Ways and Means Committee can be maneuvered into the position where the president can say we would be swimming in solid currency, but for the House of Representatives, that'd be a tremendously inviting target to run against.
Ask for it.
No clause, even in the 14th Amendment, that has been so radically misconstrued for 80 years, 60 years at least, is the First Amendment. And it seems to me if this has a chilling effect, good. I was in Colorado when this happened, and the Rocky Mountain News newspaper in Denver had a big headline the next day, and it just said, Reagan's stable. Well, Reagan's critics have been saying for 20 years he's not stable. And what he demonstrated in this crisis was a tremendous presence and grace under pressure. And I agree entirely with you that spring training ended, in a sense, for this administration. In the real season, their first crisis began. They improvised and they handled it very well. Gun control raises constitutionally interesting questions. It's just a matter of pragmatism and prudence, and will it work? My feeling is that a country that already has, Lord knows how many scores of millions of handguns already in circulation, combined with open borders and all the rest, that's not the way to go, and I agree with you. I don't think it's getting the judiciary to enforce it. I think it's taking away from the judiciary the discretion they now have.
You mean
mandatory sentences for any felony involving a handgun. Because, you know, Martin, you used in your question to Hugh, you said the unthinkable has happened, and Hugh rightly says not unthinkable, it's routine. I don't know how it was at Time magazine, but I'm told that at Newsweek, people came in the next day and they had gone in mentally into their assassination mode. They knew what stories had to go. You've done it before. You get your general handgun article done. This has become a routine of American life. Surely one of the alarming facts about the kind of assassinations we've seen, John Lennon's attack had nothing to do with John Lennon or with music or with anything else. This attack, the attack on Wallace, utterly unrelated to the subject in an important sense, other than a kind of working out of private turmoils on the part of disturbed people. Therefore, while it is reasonable to hold that a deterrence theory of punishment will broadly work in the general population, because the general population is more or less reachable by changed incentives, fear, punishment, There's no reason to believe that any of these people would have been deterred by that. But one of the criticisms against conservatives in this country, and particularly conservative leaders, is that they are somehow passionate, unstable, apt to go off half-cocked. And when Jimmy Carter perfected the I can be calm in a crisis theme against Kennedy in the primaries, it carried over really into the general election. And there was a general reluctance, even on election day. A lot of people who voted for Reagan had still doubts in their minds as to whether or not he had the sort of fundamental presidential stability and gravity, and I do think he answered that. Now, obviously, it would be irrational to say he behaved well in the emergency room, therefore we're going to cut food stamps. But that's not how it works. I think Hugh's right. There's an intangible sense. It becomes harder to fight him. The tone of argument against him changes, and I think it ought to. His remark that Wagner's music is better than it sounds. Now, Haig sounds worse than he is, in a way. I mean, he was not seizing control. That was not the 7th day of the 7 days in May. He just does have a manner, and I think perhaps he spent a lot of formative years in government at the Haldeman-Ehrlichman School of Congeniality, where you develop some pretty rough manners. And he is, I think, as Hugh suggests, perhaps tone-deaf to the internal harmonies of the Reagan administration. But I do think he is Secretary of State. The point is the Russians. The point is foreign policy and not amicability within the executive branch. From the wage price question, 10 times more important than the cost of energy is the general decline of productivity, which I associate more with the low savings ratio in this country. And it seems to me that the Reagan program directly addresses this by cutting taxes, particularly on so-called unearned income. It seems to me that when if the laws of economics hold at all, if the American people are still responsive to altered incentives, and there's no reason to doubt that they are, then the Reagan program, which is designed to increase the cost of consumption relative to work, or rather leisure relative to work and consumption relative to savings, to make people save more and work harder, is exactly what the country needs. Chinese have this advantage. That is, their cars are cheaper and their cars are better. Now, that's a pretty good...
You'll hear from them.
Now, it seems to me that's why I take a very hard-nosed view about protecting the automobile industry. I agree with Joe. You can't revitalize this economy without revitalizing the automobile industry. My God, it's 8.5% of the economy, its products and services. It's 25% of retail sales. You just have to do it. And we ought to face the fact.
May I?
It was 1.9 million last year, and no one says you have to cut it back to 1.6. You could cut it back to 1.2. Furthermore, Martin, as Joe said, General Motors and these people are raising the prices of their cars, whereas the earnings position of the Japanese car makers have them perfectly positioned to defend or even expand their market share by cutting prices. Unless there is a physical limit on the imports of Japanese cars, the American automobile industry is going to stay stagnant.
Sure.
They're not. Look, we all understand that in the best of all possible worlds, everyone would be free trade. That's not true. If they don't do it, it's going to be legislated by Congress. I guarantee it, Mark. See our pent-up demand for automobiles. That's why they're planning a 20% increase in capacity in the next 3 years. And I see no reason to believe that they're not going to expand their market share. But could we go back just a minute to the question of who's on whose bandwagon? One of the ironies of what happened to the president in the Senate Budget Committee, where the Republicans have a majority, is that the Republicans for 20 years have finally won the argument just at a time when they want to get off it. That is, they've said the problem is the deficit. And Grassley and Sims, two guys who have 6 years to go before they have to face the voters again, couldn't even give their president that vote because they said we're worried about the deficit. Just at a point when the Republicans are saying it's not the deficit that's the problem, it's more complicated than that. What you mean by fundamental? I think clearly the United States is more convinced of the need for linkage because knowing the United States Senate, they know that linkage is an accomplished fact. That is, you cannot get ratified arms control agreements as long as the Soviet Union is conducting, as it has been since Angola and South Vietnam, a geopolitical assault against this country. Therefore, it's not a theoretical question, it's a practical reality. We have linkage. The question really should be posed, will there be an invasion? The question is, will solidarity be smashed? And it can be smashed without an invasion if you get the right smashers in the offices in Warsaw. To me, Martin, there was nothing encouraging about Brezhnev's speech in Prague because they have now thoroughly defined the issue as socialism against anti-socialist elements, and they have come as close as they can to defining solidarity as an anti-socialist, which is a treasonous element in Poland. That draws the lines of conflict so sharply. Can I just... if that country starts losing the places where its government has no legitimacy, it will crumble to the gates of Moscow, because the Soviet Union is a hodgepodge of subdued nationality. I understand that, but let me tell you why I think there's still going to be a crisis in Poland. And there's a little incident happened when Walesa went to Rome to visit the Pope. He went south one day to Monte Cassino, where some Poles fought in a battle in the Second World War, and he laid a wreath. Now, the striking thing to me about that is that's the act of a head of state, making national gestures at national symbols. That symbolizes to me the fact that the government of Poland is barely an occupying power now, that all the legitimacy has been drained away, whatever attached to it, from the Communist Party, and that's the crisis in the Polish system. Whether it be by intervention, which I still expect, and if not by intervention, it will be because they get the right Stalinist hacks from the Polish party in power to do their dirty work. I don't think it'll be probably Washington hazard. Because it seems to me there's no city in the world, no spot on earth where there's more concentrated ambition. Therefore, there's no spot on earth where there's more concentrated envy and more concentrated temptation to cut corners. And particularly so in the news business, because the essence of the news business is limited space and unlimited ego. But George, ask yourself why they're destructive. I think Hugh also put his finger on something essential, and that is the way, as soon as the police and the mayor, that is the public officials and the certain groups, politicians and police that are not widely looked up to in this society, as soon as they challenged it, there was a tendency evidently to close ranks around the story. Stonewall it. And, well, yes, I mean, what did the Post know and when did it know it and all these other questions. But the point is that there was a perhaps too easy a tendency to assume that very little virtue inheres in public authorities. Well, I absolutely feel the first obligation, had Jimmy existed, was to Jimmy. Right. And this is something that comes up over and over again. Martin, let me just tie this down, because it really comes back to a larger issue, and that is, are journalists citizens first? I happen to think they are. Journalists are frequently called upon as citizens not to publish certain things because it would be bad for the country. Military information and other things. Everyone around this table, around this circle here, has information in his head that would make a good story and you won't publish. I'm positive of it. Now, that's because you are citizens first, not people trying to maximize the electricity of journalism. That's not the end of government. That the United States is back where it ought to have been all along, which is vigorously pursuing the greatest possible adventure, confronting the human species. When I was in Italy and Europe shortly after the fiasco in the Iranian desert last year in the rescue attempt, Italians and others were referring to that as a negative moon landing. That is, as a symbol of American incompetence, just as the moon landing was in 1969 a symbol of America's capacity to do large things. I think the country needed this. I think the country ought to insist on excellence, and I think it's preposterous and degrading for us to defend such a thing as this in terms of the technological fallout, non-stick frying pans and other stuff that's come out of this research, because this is just so good for the national spirit, and the national spirit matters in a lot of tangible ways. Some also make this point. Some of my conservative friends have nothing good to say about government. This was a government program. Government said we're going to do it, and they did it. And it's been very good for the country. Well, to do that, they need to read the Constitution. He has the power to veto, and you can argue all you want about whether Amtrak should get this or legal service should get that, but a president with the control of the Senate that he has can enforce his veto, and he has the will to do it. That's why he has the high ground on the budget cuts, and Congress has the whip hand on the tax claim judgment. I can think of no more wounding or damaging adjective to apply to a decision than to say that it is Carter-esque. This is a Carter-esque unilateral and unreciprocated concession, damaging in a fundamental way the believability of this administration. I understand the administration's reasoning, and if I'm not being generous in crediting them with reasoning on this, it is that a grain embargo is imposed because the Soviet Union invades country A and is lifted because it fails so far to invade country B. Now, Jack cites the fact that the president made a foolish campaign promise regarding this around about the time of the Iowa caucuses. Well, that's all very well, but he had in Poland, Jack, a perfect excuse for getting off a campaign promise he never should have made. And instead now, with the Soviet Union circling Poland still, and the Soviet Union daily violating the Helsinki Agreement, wherein they are committed not to use even the threat of force to influence the evolution of a society and their country and their government, while this administration remains silent about this violation of the Helsinki Agreement, it rewards unilaterally and unreciprocatedly the absence of an invasion. It's preposterous. Implying that the Reagan administration talks a much better game of foreign policy than it plays, and we're in danger of having a foreign policy that is Cyrus Vance without the charm of Cyrus Vance. This was imposed originally because of the invasion of Afghanistan. The Afghanistan freedom fighters are today making the Soviets pay dearly in a tremendously heroic uphill fight in that country. What a demoralizing, what a callous and insulting blow this is to them at this point. Furthermore, Jack, I tell you, this administration is in real danger with acts like this of trivializing itself. Going down, and I mean way down in history, is the administration that got tough with the National Aquarium and OSHA and the FTC and didn't have the kidney to fulfill its own rhetoric about Libya, Cuba, and the Soviet Union. Well, it's the administration who say that we can do this now because in some sense the crisis in Poland is over. Now, I would like to meet the semanticist who can make sense of the idea that that crisis is over. It seems to me much more likely that this reduces the pressure on the Soviet Union not to do what I think in the end it still will do, which is crack down on Poland. Because what will happen, suppose they invade Poland, then we'll impose some more economic sanctions. And then 3 or 4 months later, the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union will say, but we're not going to invade Paraguay. And we'll say, well, fine, if you're not going to invade Paraguay, we'll take it off. Let's concentration of power in the executive office in Washington. Yet the conservative movement, as we've seen in the 1 month and a day since the president was shot, the entire cause is bound up with the ability of this man to articulate and, let's be frank, to threaten. The president walked into the chamber tonight, was warmly applauded, smiled as sweetly as only he can, and then threatened. He threatened a particular committee of Congress. He focused the entire attention of the nation on this. And it was an act of, as they say on the Hill these days, hardball. Chairman Jones is from Oklahoma, which I think is in many ways the most conservative state in the Union. Tip O'Neill is from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and probably is bewildered by much of what is happening in the country. As one Southern Democrat said the other day, if the Democratic Party is the party as defined by Tip O'Neill, there are virtually no Democrats in my district. All right, they want the Republican Party. I think the former is fair to assume. I think the president, to his credit, has staffed his administration, including his White House staff and his cabinet, with some very strong-willed people, and they do tend to fall to fighting one another like children in a playground, it seems, when he's not there to be a good disciplinarian. Whether or not, with him back at the helm, on more or less full-time basis, that will be rectified remains to be seen. This president, unlike a number of recent presidents, doesn't have to be encouraged to think about domestic politics. He really seems to like it, and that's his primary concern. That probably accounts for the fact that his foreign policy is, to put it politely, disorderly at the moment, and it remains to be seen whether or not he can bring the kind of order and purposefulness and concerted energy to that problem as he can to domestic policy. All right. Surely the test of civility in a society such as ours is that the big battalions are not the only ones who get help. Let me give you just one example of a vote that it seems to me ought to disturb conservatives. A Senate committee this week took out a page, in effect, from the Social Security program that has existed since 1935. They took out some enrichments added since then, but they went all the way back to 1935 and took out an entitlement for aid for children in foster care. Cut it and threw it into a block grant program, which means, no doubt, it will be lost when it gets to the states. Now, procedurally, conservatives ought to be concerned about due process. To have this happen with almost no hearings, they have really no idea what effect this will have. That should be alarming. The notion substantively that what this country could afford in 1935 for children under foster care it can't afford now, and third, if there's anything conservatives talk a lot about at this time, it is family and the care of children and how they are raised, and it seems to me demonstrably irresponsible to do that from a conservative point of view. You bothers me about the argument I hear from my friend Stockman and others is I don't mind them saying we have to do this because it's good for the economy. We have to do this because it's good for the world. Everyone must sacrifice. Make your economic arguments. But stop short of saying these people don't need the money, because real people are getting hurt out there. And it is callous. There's a kind of elegant hard-heartedness in all this free market arguing. People have to be hurt, and the allocation of scarcity is what politics in the 1980s may be about, but let's not pretend we're not hurting people. And the argument, frankly, that the truly needy are not going to be hurt is the moral equivalent of what the president, when he said as candidate during the campaign, when, you may recall, these tax cuts were going to be self-financing. There wasn't much talk about budget cuts at that time because we believed then in Art Laffer's economics. Operating to be the awesome silence of thought, because they may understand that they have to think before they speak. And that, to me, is the most interesting fact about politics in May 1981. through the Nixon and Ford, and especially in the Carter years, there were article after article written saying the country is ungovernable, the Constitution is out of date because the separation of powers and single-issue constituencies and all that guarantees paralysis, a stalemate. It does seem as though the logjam has been broken, and it has been broken in a very satisfying way by a president with a consensus and the ability to talk to the country and a party behind him. All of which, it seems to me, presupposes an idea, an animating vision of some sort. The Republicans have it now. Didn't used to, won't someday. Democrats have to find one. Thatcher put it well in the House of Commons when she said that Mr. Sands chose to die, and that's not a choice that the terrorist organization of which he is a member gives its victims. She was supported in the House of Commons strongly by Mr. Foote, the leader of the opposition. Only one member of the House of Commons vehemently disputed her policy. Had she granted political status to Sands and all the rest, then they would have stood convicted by semantic fiat, really, of holding political prisoners. Now, capturing the vocabulary of these struggles is very important. We have a Syrian peacekeeping force, so-called, that's now trying to conquer Syria. We had, this week I heard a major news organization in this country describe Grapo, a Spanish terrorist organization, as anti-fascist militants. Now, there's an extraordinary sentimentality built into it, the coverage of these things. As television reduces the coverage of Ireland to a small square like this, and we tend to forget the fact that the provisional IRA, if it has 400 members, I would be very surprised, is a killing organization. No question about it. And that's what terrorists understand perfectly, is the importance of communication satellites, the ability of dominating every living room in the world. The old theory was kill one, scare 100. Yeah. In the media age, it's kill one, scare 50 million. So, in the first place, about 55% of those who eventually are going to receive Social Security benefits are retiring at 62. It's most of the people, in other words, who are affected by this. The letters started coming in immediately to Capitol Hill, a man saying, I've sold my house, I'm planning to move to Florida, but I was doing all this on the assumption that at 62 I would get 85 or whatever it was, now 55% of my benefits. Clearly, something has to be done for the Social Security system, and it's reasonably clear that what must be done is you must gradually is the operative phrase here, raise the age at which people begin to get Social Security. But there are lots of ways of doing it that do not seem, as this move did seem, to be,
you mean again, beyond 65.
That's right. Really, you could say you start in 1990, and then every year raise by 2 months the retirement age until you got to 68 instead of 65. Then you would have a fairly, with some disability provisions. Sure, some version of that. It has to happen. Because Social Security is two things. It is the biggest item in big government, and it is unquestionably the most sacrosanct program in America.
I would agree with that. I would say that
are understandably electric with fear about touching the Social Security system. And this is a matter of tremendous political importance. The great social fact in the United States in the 1980s...
In the true sense of the word political.
Yes, the great social fact is the aging of the population. The median age of this country is going to go up 5 years in the next 10 years. In 1980, Martin, while 51% of the country was bothering to go to the polls and vote, 65% of those 65 and older bothered to vote. The American Association of Retired Persons here in town had, I think, 1.5 million members at the beginning of the 70s. That's a lot of members in itself. Today, they have 12 million members. This is unquestionably the most formidable lobby. In the early 60s, it was John Kennedy who introduced, as I understand it, the 62-year age retirement as a jobs program, as a way of sopping up some unemployment. Surely, as we extend life expectancy and cause actuarial assumptions about all our pension systems to be blown away, as we extend life expectancy, there's going to be a good social reason for wanting people to work longer.
What do you think of Mr. Reagan's reaction?
Markets, and they saw the financial markets needed a signal that the first wave of budget cuts would be followed by a second wave, and that the safety net, so-called, would not be exempt. He sent this up as a way of reassuring the markets, and it may have produced exactly the opposite effect. 96-0 may tell Wall Street and the others that the safety net cannot be touched.
There's also a democratic move in there, George.
How to combat a weapon that the Soviet Union is using in Afghanistan.
Is gas in Afghanistan? Can you really document
Well, it's a little hard to document what's going on in the valleys of Afghanistan, but there are plenty of reports about the use of they've seen the equipment, the detoxification equipment. We've seen ample evidence of the training of Soviet troops through the years in the use and detoxification after the use of these weapons. We have seen We have lots of reports from Afghanistan that this has indeed occurred. Yes, I see no reason to doubt it.
At the risk in World War II. And I think you might well.
World War II is a subject I missed owing to having been in the cradle at the time.
That's
However,
true, George.
the fact is that we know about the manufacturing capacity, the military theory supporting the use of these weapons in the Soviet Union, and I see no reason to doubt it.
Martin,
I'd rather
CIA.
spend a
Well,
making getting
well, that's all right, Martin, but let me tell you, I went into this.
Guys who want to suck up every dollar we've got here on the Hill. Now, that is what bothers
Just
me.
listen to the hyperbole here. Indecency, lunacy. Surely we can discuss these things without
Well,
that.
no, I know indecent.
Right?
Well, you say he's going to be appointed. He's nominated, and it's up to the
said
Senate.
nominated.
It's up to the Senate to advise and consent.
Certainly.
There are three kinds of arguments about Mr. Lefever. One is whether or not you like the policy he represents, and if it's the president's policy, then that seems to me you yield on that because the president won the election.
He's entitled to the policy.
He's entitled to the policy he wants. There are two other questions about Mr. Lefever. One running to charges of mendacity and testifying, and the other running to charges of conflicts of interest pertaining to the Center for Public Policy that he's been associated with.
Well, let's take the mendacity and testifying. He said...
I think what he said was that some was communist-inspired, and there's enough to argue about there. I think that indicates the use of gasoline around a fire in this town, to talk like that.
One of the worst details,
First,
does that concern you?
Sure it does, but let's put this in perspective. Carl says, 2 years tax cut fine, 3 years risky, dangerous, and brown bears in caves.
Well, 2 are risky, but I'll go with...
If we only get 2, our taxes go up. Let's just underscore that. Rowan wants our taxes to go up. That's really what's at issue here. With regard to defense, in the first place, the Navy particularly, which gets the lion's share of the great increase, cannot handle through its shipbuilding program as rapid a flow of the funds as some people think is going to come about. Second, if Reagan gets every penny of the defense increases he's seeking, Martin, by the time he gets them, we will still be spending, I believe it is 2 percentage points less of our GNP on defense than we were spending when John Kennedy was president and when inflation was 1.2%. So there's really no grounds for believing that an adequate national defense is incompatible with a stable currency. Am I understanding Rowan right? Rowan is saying that CETA is a national security necessity because unless we fund CETA and some other social programs, people will then not fight for the country.
Well, let me
is that your
tell you
argument?
this.
I don't understand your point.
Well, then I won't
About that on this show for years. The fact that someone out on the Nimitz, where they just had the tragedy, who's working as a mechanic on the Nimitz, if he's a Navy mechanic and not contracted out, is being paid less on a per-hour basis than a cashier at McDonald's. It is a disgrace. I don't think they should delay the pay increase. And I will bet you that about 98% of the military and their extended families voted for Ronald Reagan. Probably the largest single block vote in the country. And I think they should not delay the July increase.
Yeah.
Name 3 people who share Lefever's point of view on human rights. One is the Secretary of State.
Exactly.
One is the Ambassador to the United Nations, and the third is the President of the United States. So that point of view will not lack for voices with or without Mr. Lefever. One problem is that the President is focusing all this energy and hope on getting the economic package through and the tax cuts and all of this. Summer recess will be coming up before that long, and there may be a filibuster over Mr. Lefever. That being so, while it is clear that
Mr. Kraft,
not intend to...
There may still be
There-
one.
So while I think it's quite clear that Mr. Lefever cannot expect President Reagan to back away from him, it's also clear that perhaps Mr. Lefever owes something to the President in terms of considering whether or not it is in the interests, the larger interests of the administration he's trying to join, that he withdraw.
Martin.
At an early stage, earlier than this, but an early stage in the Carter administration, the Warnke nomination got into trouble. By the time it came to a vote in the Senate, there were 41 senators in a Democratic-controlled Senate ready to vote against him. It would have been well for the country and for the cause of arms control had Mr. Warnke not gone ahead and taken the job, particularly as the combined job as negotiator of the SALT II treaty, because he did indeed negotiate a treaty that could not be got through the Senate.
Yeah, but
Martin, Israel's special vulnerability and Iraq's special ferocity and the reliability of Israeli intelligence, I think their act is defensible. Well, I'd respond that I think he's more exercised than a number of the parties are, including a number of the parties that pretend to be greatly exercised. I would be very surprised if the Saudis weren't secretly pleased to see the Iraqi program set back. I'm certain the French government, the new French government, is relieved to have responsibility for that reactor off its shoulders. and has probably spared it an important and difficult decision of backing off, if indeed they could have at this point. So I think Rowan is probably breaking the world record in indignation at the moment. George, I'd like to recur to what I take to be the principle Carl is endorsing here, which is that no nation has a right to undertake an act of war when not in a fighting war to disarm another nation. Okay. You probably see where I'm going, which is to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yeah. We called it a quarantine, what we did on the high seas. It was a blockade, and it's pretty close to being an act of war.
No, they made them. Take them out.
They're not taking them out. We would have used force, and we did it because we decided that that was a military threat, though not activated. They're not indeed threatened for use against the United States explicitly, as the Iraqis have explicitly said their nuclear capacity was aimed against Israel, yet we did it. What's the difference?
That is
that Carl Rowan have a preemptive strike on the point, which is there not a similarity here between the Cuban Missile Crisis and what's happened in the Middle East? I do assume. But we tend to lose sight of the brute fact here, which is that today, there is one fewer potential nuclear weapons facility in the world than there was a week ago. Now, let's look ahead for a change. Let's suppose that Gaddafi, a certifiable, unstable man, to put it politely, were to use his enormous wealth with the same leverage that has been effective with other nuclear powers and begin to develop such a weapon. Who here really believes that the world is better off if Gaddafi has nuclear weapons? Nobody. Who here believes that the world is not better off if we accept the admittedly dangerous anarchic element in nations self-helping the way the Israelis did, if that self-help is directed against someone like Gaddafi having something like that weapon?
I would add it, but don't...
To govern is to choose, Churchill said. Now, are you going to choose to let him develop it, or are you going to choose to take the admittedly unpleasant step of taking or asking someone else to take or tolerating someone else taking?
Even though you have developed it yourself.
You're suggesting a moral symmetry between Iraq, Israel, and the United States?
Did you read our friend Joe Kraft's column the other day where he says Americans must not be afraid to say that Yasser Arafat is no more prone to use terrorism than Menachem Begin?
It's absurd.
Well,
you basically, aside from the fact that I want to watch baseball, I don't care about anyone's civil rights when that's involved, but the basic issue is that 26 baseball teams are not like 26 shoe stores. If you have one of 26 shoe stores, you can be glad to run the other 25 out of business. Baseball depends on 26 reasonably strong teams to have competitive balance. So you have to have kind of socialism in the American pastime, which is a little hard to take, but we have to admit it. Given that the baseball owners have a grain of truth in their claim that they need some compensation when they lose to a richer team, a player, they ought to get a player back from the other team. The real problem is that the owners have a grain of truth, but not a grain of sense. They don't know how to negotiate. If they would turn this over to all our friend Ed Williams, who owns the Baltimore Orioles, they'd be back on the field in 24 hours. Meanwhile, the president ought to either nationalize them, send them into the Army, the way Truman nationalized the steel mills, or at least call Bowie Kuhn and tell him that this is a national calamity, which it is. Some teams, including my own beloved Chicago Cubs, stand to make more money from their strike insurance than they have been making at the gate. So wretched have the Cubs been playing. But again, I repeat,
your Cubs were hot.
White hot. That's why they went on strike. Part of what is on his mind is what has already been discussed in this program, and that is the disappointments that presidents have suffered since Teddy Roosevelt became dissatisfied with Oliver Wendell Holmes, and Roosevelt with Frankfurter, and Eisenhower with Warren. That is the sense that it's rather hard to predict. Second, the president has made some commitments, or semi-commitments. First, there's that unfortunate matter of the gender-based distinction on the women.
Don't you think it's important to have a woman on the court?
No, I don't think it's a particle important to have anyone of any particular gender. I think we've gone so long without having a majority of good jurists on the court that would be quite good enough to have that.
But it has been 192 years and 101 justices, and they've all been male.
Well, it's a melancholy and lamentable fact, but I think it probably is a fact that if we went back and checked the percentage of women in law school in the relevant age group that the president now has to draw from, it would probably be something under 5%, probably around 2% were women. And it's a little hard to just out of goodwill rectify what that fact means in terms of the limited talent pool to call upon. The Republican platform, as you may recall, stirred up a small tornado in Detroit last summer when it said that among the things that they would be looking for are justices who were sensitive, I haven't got the words exactly, but to the sanctity of innocent human life. Now, it's very clear they were talking about abortion, It's far from clear how you ask a question of a candidate for the court to ascertain how useful he will be to the right-to-life viewpoint. There are two ways of going about this. If you could get a sort of severe hardliner on the issue, who would be just as much of a judicial legislator as the people were on the other side, on this court in the 70s, and say, well, we simply will say that the word person in the 14th Amendment covers any life, human life after conception. But that would really be a kind of judicial activism of the sort I think the president doesn't approve of.
Now, the conservative...
Well, I was enchanted by Professor Dershowitz saying, well, their conservatives are just as bad as liberals. It's sort of the Nixon defense here, that is, we all do it. I really think that he's wrong in asserting that we have had a conservative court. By some measures, I believe the court in the 1970s has been as radically activist, as unconstrained by judicial reasoning, as uninterested in constitutional values as the Warren Court ever was. Certainly the Warren Court did nothing more radical than the abortion decision, which simply invented a right to privacy almost out of thin air, and then used it to strike down the laws of 50 states. You can't get much more radical than that.
The Burger Court was radical.
I certainly wouldn't confine it just to the abortion decisions. The Weber decision regarding affirmative action. I'm not sure at what point we decided that nude dancers were exercising a First Amendment protection, but it's now established in constitutional law, and I think got established in the 1970s. Busing has proceeded. Busing to cure conditions clearly not caused by prior discriminatory action, and to bring about conditions, it seems to me, not mandated by the Constitution. George, careful. That is, if he doesn't go for the easy, deceptive way of picking a gray practitioner, but who gets a theoretically inclined, scholarly person who has written in the law reviews, whose premises and principles can be examined and looked at, and some are now already on the list. If he goes for people like this, he can have an extraordinarily long-lasting impact, far more important than anything he's done so far in cutting CETA and others of these budgetary cuts. And also, of course, it's important to get a man or a woman who is relatively young, someone in their 50s. Well, I think you really have to have quite a thirst for martyrdom to suggest that what the court did today represents in any way the thin end of the wedge of tyranny. What the court did today was not impose restrictions on anyone. It said, as it has said many times before, that local jurisdictions have a right to set time, place, and manner restrictions, so long as they do not go to the content of what is being expressed, so long as they serve a legitimate public purpose and are not too broad to achieve that purpose. So I really find it very hard to see how this can represent in any way either an affront to the First Amendment freedoms or in any way a discrimination against this group, which after all did say in its oral argument and in its brief that it was not claiming that this was necessarily an integral part of its religious practices, this fundraising, but indeed that they were content to rest their claim simply on the fundraising activities as speech, no more dignified than any other group or charitable organization. I think they're saying that there's something slightly more intrusive, slightly more lacerating to the feelings, slightly more open to fraud, perhaps, in actually taking money. And therefore, in the interests of a state fair that in 12 days has 1.3 million visitors, they wanted to keep the lanes a little bit clear. But I agree with you. I would be amused and entertained, I'm sure, to have the gentlemen of the Supreme Court tell us what they have done today that they have not authorized communities to do many times in the past, which is regulate time, place, and manner. You can't use loudspeakers. You can't, at night in residential neighborhoods, you can't demonstrate on school property during school sessions. You can't have your parades at the most busy intersection at the busiest time of day necessarily. There are all kinds of restrictions on when we speak and when we intrude ourselves on other people's lives. Sam, I think modern life is so wildly intrusive and lacerating to our feelings. There's a great deal of room for local authorities to tighten up the ability of groups to harass people for their profit.
Message to the Soviet Union, to their client states about the immunities they do not enjoy.
You regard it as a message to the Soviet Union?
Certainly do. It is day one, perhaps, of America's return to the world. So you cannot allow the psychotic dictators of tin-pot countries to repeal the basic considerations of the law of the seas. Therefore, I think in that sense he was right. I'd also like to pick up on something you said, bringing in the air controller strike. I looked upon that and as being, I hoped, not so much a domestic policy as a harbinger of an attitude in foreign policy. That is, when there's a fundamental challenge to the sovereign power of the United States government, it would be met. And it's interesting that I'm told that some ambassadors in town looked upon and commented upon the air traffic controller strike in exactly that way, as a harbinger of an attitude the president would have to fairly fundamental challenges reaching the power of the executive upon the children. And the lies of previous administrations should not build the ground for skepticism, it seems to me, about this one. And I do not agree with it. A generation of journalists is living off the skepticism they rather too much enjoyed about administrations that lied rather more than necessary. I do not believe a moral symmetry exists between the government in Washington and the government in Libya. And I do not believe, absent any evidence, that the conflicts between the story as given out by Libya and that given out by the honorable men and women who serve in the United States government, that we should weigh in the balance the Libyan claims. Because I do it better than Martin. What I am saying is, Martin, is that absent evidence, there is no reason for presuming the American government guilty of mendacity. If you have evidence, give it. Allow the maneuvers of the United States fleet to be circumscribed by the dictates, the preposterous and unlawful dictates of Gaddafi.
I am saying that to wisdom, not to provoke it.
Exactly.
Now, George, we'll discuss the provocative aspects of this particular maneuver. You didn't have the opportunity yet, as is your wont, to accuse me of taking the position of Ephesians. Would you like to make that proposal?
Never miss a chance, Martin. You said granted, I think that you're willing to grant that Gaddafi's claim is preposterous and indefensible. Still, it might be better not to go into the waters he's claiming lest we have an incident. Hitler makes an indefensible claim to sovereignty over the Sudetenland, where there was an option then. You could challenge him, or you could say it's best not to waste the bones of a British soldier over a country in Central Europe. I think it is a precise analogy. Captured American soldiers have been hacked to death by axes in the demilitarized zone in Korea, and never was there an appropriate American response. There had to be one sooner or later. It is nevertheless the case that last year was a bad year for an American wage earner. That's one of the reasons why we changed presidents, is we had the biggest decline in real income since 1947, a 5.5% decline. But this is not news. That was the news of 1980. The mandate the president won for increasing defense is much clearer than the mandate the president received, for example, for cutting the budget. Indeed, there was no mandate for cutting the budget, because the president campaigned from one end of the country to the other, from one end of the campaign to the other, on the premise that the tax program would be self-financing. That is, that it would so stimulate business and so stimulate revenues to the government that it wouldn't need to cut any particular programs. All right, he took that back, and now he's had to cut some programs. But then to turn around and say, in order to cut more, we should begin to cut what the president campaigning said was an already inadequate military program, is, it seems to me, risking national security now on the altar of supply-side economics. But he goes predominantly to the middle class. It is the biggest program.
That politically, George.
That is a good question, and that's exactly what I'm saying, is now that you come to cutting programs that cannot be dismissed as welfare, and you're cutting the programs that absorb the great constituency of the United States, the middle class, it seems to me you have to stop and say, maybe we need to start looking for new sources of revenue, new sources.
You're going to get away from the type.
There are terrific savings available in the defense budget, and the Secretary of the Navy, in a speech about 8 days ago, outlined some of them in the way we handle our contracts. However, it seems to me to go immediately from the first problem you have with your economic projections to calling into question fundamental military programs such as the MX, and doubtless Kilpatrick will be after B-1 next, seems to me to be a rash leap.
Those Minuteman missiles are not vulnerable. Amen.
There's an economic incentive that everyone, for their short-term economic gain, wants to define the problem away. Furthermore, the President and the Secretary of State have both undermined their own argument by going about giving speeches about how the Soviet system is so internally rickety that it may collapse of its own accord and be remembered as an aberration in the mid-20th century. It's not a question of paperwork, it's a question of philosophy. He just happens to be 180 degrees wrong about the philosophy. This may be, Carl may have said it right, that this is a turning away from a commitment made in the 1970s and late 60s. I certainly hope so, because that commitment was fundamentally incompatible with the 14th Amendment and 200 years of American history. That is, the doctrine of racial entitlements, the doctrine of allocating wealth and opportunity on the basis of chromosomes and skin pigmentation, is a violation of the fundamental premise of America, which is that rights inhere not in groups but in individuals. The fundamental difference is this. You say that the Constitution mandates an integrated society. I say it forbids a segregated society, and there's all the difference in the world in that. Really, a great nation that has the option to lead the world, indeed the only nation that can lead the world, and the greatest adventure open to mankind, is voluntarily and unnecessarily opting out. And I think in 200 years, people will look upon this as evidence that we're still, in a sense, in the dark ages of our understanding.
Ronald Reagan is like anchovies. He's an acquired taste, and an awful lot of Americans don't care to acquire it. No question that Israel is, to some extent, being judged by its leader more than I think is necessary, just as, I think, Ted, Americans tend to think rather more tranquilly about Egypt than they should, simply because they're rather more fond of Sadat than the normal Egyptian leader. All right, that does appear. There are 2 points, however, Ted. The first is it's not clear to the extent to which he can or actually will call off his troops, to the extent that we want to call the Israeli lobby in this country his troops. Second, a good many of the senators who are prepared to vote against the AWAC sale are prepared to do so not just or even primarily because of the threat that ostensibly poses to Israel, but rather because they don't like the Saudi Arabian attitude toward the United States, and they particularly don't like placing valuable technology in a high-risk area. I think the differences have been papered so much as they have been stared at and seem to be intractable, and we have to go on to things we can deal with. Prime Minister Reagan did not cause the occupation of the West Bank. He did not start the settlements policy there. The United States never acknowledged the Jordanian attempt to annex the West Bank for years. If we asked Reagan to relinquish it, the question would remain, to whom? Jordan, I'm not clear in my own mind, wants it. They certainly won't negotiate for it. To the PLO, this administration can hardly push a radical departure in policy with clearly a terrorist organization, having made international terrorism one of its main emphases. So I don't think they've been papered over, Ted. I just think that it's mature men and women facing the fact that there are lots of problems they can't solve and some assets they can make use of.
Would you?
Well, even if we assume, and I suppose because he was Sadat's chosen successor, we can assume that the vice president's heart is behind Sadat's policies. What you have to ask is this: what are the odds that a society like Egypt and a political system like theirs will churn to the surface 2 in a row? That is, 2 people with the inclination and the political skill to resist the tremendous gravitational pull in the region to, in the euphemism, reconcile Egypt with the rejectionist front. So it requires not just an inclination, but a kind of political capacity that's rare in the best and most mature of countries. And Egypt is not the most mature, promising political society. Well, I don't know. There can be bribery, I suppose. I mean, the simple offer of cash. And in this regard, we have to wonder what our newfound friends, the Saudis, are going to do. Are they going to be a force for moderation at this critical moment with regard to keeping Egypt where the Saudis, we are told, say their heart is, which is with the West and with the moderates, such as they are in the Middle East? Second, the Reagan administration will, I assume, want to expedite ways of demonstrating the critical thing in the Middle East, which the Sadat assassination must call into question. That is it more dangerous to be the friend of the United States or its enemy? No, Ted, and I didn't mean to sound disparaging. I do think that the evidence about the genuine convictions and the real heart of the Saudis is mixed. There is no question that they continue to fund some of the extremist elements in the Middle East, this being rationalized as kind of protection money. We're supposed to say that's not their real inclination. This is one of those moments in the Middle East where people have to stand up and be counted, which is something the Saudis do not like to do and have not been pushed to do. Therefore, it seems to me the eyes have to shift now to the other of the so-called pillars of our strength in the Middle East. We had 3 going into today, now we have 2. We're down to Israel and Saudi Arabia. The fact remains that Israel has to look a little better and a little more important tonight because it's the only regime in the Middle East that cannot be changed by a bullet.
Mr. Sidey?
No, he's got it exactly wrong. The problem is not that we don't understand Libya, but that we understand Libya perfectly. Libya is an open little green book that madman in Libya who wrote the book keeps reading to the world. It is a country sinking under the weight of $13 billion in Soviet arms, saturated with 3,000 East Bloc advisors, making war on Chad, threatening Niger, bombing the Sudan, detested generally throughout the Arab world, for which the Prime Minister, Mr. Gaddafi, purports to speak. It was said earlier, Sam, that there was no proof that Libya was connected with the death of Sadat. I don't know what counts as proof, whether it's fingerprints on the Soviet assault rifles that were used, but in fact, Gaddafi said that he who assassinates Sadat would be welcomed as a hero in the Islamic world, and anyone who incites to assassination is culpable for the following assassination. Well, first, they use it, Sam, because they can prove it. Vice President Bush could trace the fingerprints of Gaddafi's assassination squads to Athens, to Rome, and to London, and elsewhere. Furthermore, I do believe that they understand that sooner or later, someone armed by the United States must polish off someone armed by the Soviet Union, and Gaddafi's an obvious candidate. There is a sense in which Gaddafi stands to Reagan the way Castro did to Kennedy, and many people think the world would be much better off today had Castro been dealt with by the Caribbean neighbors, just as Gaddafi might be dealt with by some of his neighbors, all of whom are hostile to him. Mr. Vaughan, that's an excellent question. $8 to $9 billion of American money is going to help buy the instruments of terrorism. Clearly, it seems to me that in a period of relative oil glut in the world, it might be an opportune moment for the United States to throw the Libyans back on a smaller world market and urge our allies to demonstrate, to practice what they preach about terrorism by joining in a boycott of Libya's oil.
It's a damaging victory in two senses. He will have won it with a poisonous political tactic in part, that is, impugning the motives and even the good citizenship of some of his opponents by suggesting that they are lackeys of the Israeli lobby, a charge that comes, I think, oddly from an administration that can reasonably be accused of being obsequious towards the Saudi regime. But leaving that aside, it may be a damaging victory if it weds this country to a policy of pretending that the Saudi regime is a plausible pillar of a strategic consensus, because that, I think, misrepresents the strength of the Saudi regime in bearing this particular weight, and it also puts us on a path towards sanitizing the group that the Saudis sponsor, which is the PLO. It founded two quite different questions, one sensible, the other silly. The sensible question is, what can we do to protect Saudi Arabia? And that's a question we have to answer, and it would be nice if the Saudis would cooperate more with their own protection, instead of acting as though we're doing them an enormous favor by protecting them. But the silly question that has become entangled with this is, how can we make Saudi Arabia the center of our Middle Eastern policy? And I don't think that's
But I don't think that's
four AWACS that we have in Saudi Arabia and that the Saudi Arabians seem eager to expel. That is, let's not blink the fact that if we sell these to the Saudi Arabians, it constitutes an American withdrawal in a sense, because we have, in effect, a base in Saudi Arabia today. We have a functioning four AWACS contingent. The premise of the AWACS sale, Hugh, it seems to me, is that the Saudis want to be helpful. They haven't given the president a bit of help in extricating himself from the AWACS shambles that his ham-handed men have landed him in. Maybe this would be acceptable. Now tell me, those of you who are enthusiastic about the AWACS sale, would it not be fair for the senators, before they vote, to ask the Saudis to say something nice about the Camp David peace process, or explicitly to say we in Saudi Arabia will support and certainly will not penalize those nations that will send troops to the multinational troop contingent for the Sinai?
George.
The best vote counter on the Democratic side, as opposed to the president on this issue, saying that they're going to turn against him the president's famous campaign slogan on the Panama Canal Treaty. For instance, says regarding AWACS, we bought them, we build them, and we're going to keep them. Not just the substance, but the egregious bad taste and bad timing of our bootless ex-presidents who, flying back from the funeral of a man who broke with the PLO position and may have paid with his life for doing so, they began recommending ways of appeasing and rewarding a terrorist organization. That, it seems to me, is designed to rehabilitate radicalism in the Middle East and to cut the restraints on Egypt from being drawn back by the natural gravitational pull of the region. The death of Sadat on the slowness of the peace process. It is on the beginning of the peace process, perhaps, that his death can be a national honor, which is where increasingly we do leave it. Leave aside the fact that we've given pledges about not talking to the PLO until the PLO comes into something like a lawful stance.
Well, listen,
the candidate Reagan, on September 3rd in his B'nai B'rith speech, and again on October 18th in an interview, said, I, unlike Jimmy Carter, do not hesitate to call the PLO a terrorist organization.
All right.
In his first press conference 2 days after the election, he repeated it. Now, today, 10 months later, the PLO still is running an office in Washington. If this is a terrorist organization, and I believe the candidate and the president-elect were correct, shouldn't they be shut down? To me, we ought to go back to ground zero and say that the exercise of good taste is not an exercise of censorship, that the presence of a gossip column in a great paper, which the Post is inconsistent with the mission and dignity of the Washington Post, I strongly feel. These gossip columns, and they're now appearing on television news programs where they don't belong, seem to me just pandering to the voyeurism of a celebrity-struck public. And when you then combine the presence of those columns in your newspaper with a doctrine that says we are not responsible for the factual nature of the rumor at all, only for the fact that it is a rumor, then you have given your gossip columnist a license to disseminate lies.
Eastern policy may be, I'm afraid, the moral equivalent, as we used to say in Washington, of supply-side economics. That is, the administration domestically has put an enormous number of eggs in a very uncertain basket called supply-side theory, and we'll wait to see if that works out. Now it has put an enormous number of foreign policy eggs in, I believe, an even more implausible theory, that is the theory of Saudi moderation and helpfulness. I see no reason to believe, Ted, that what we heard here tonight is not just the surface, it is also way down deep. That is, I hope the administration, since it wants to enjoy this full night of pleasure, was not watching, because if they were, they, I think, saw their hopes begin to crumble right before their eyes. Mr. Rabin said, "Will you make peace?" He got a very dusty answer, which really meant no from the Saudi Arabians. The Saudi Arabians said, "We don't like the Camp David peace process." Dick Allen said, "We're committed to the Camp David peace process." We're back at square one. Two theories, Ted. One is, of course, that people will rethink. They will see that the Saudis have not lived up to the promises we made for them. Let's note that the Saudis haven't promised us anything because we didn't really ask them anything. And that if they don't live up to the promises we made for them, we'll cancel the deal. I think there's a much more likely lesson to be learned from what happened today. And that is that after all this talk about the Israeli lobby in the country, we're face to face with the fact that it is as nothing compared with the Saudi lobby. Because the Saudi lobby, as enumerated in some of those mobile oil ads, is a long list of extraordinarily large corporations that employ an extraordinarily large number of Americans and pay a lot of taxes. In other words, corporate America has signed on to the Saudi lobby. The real question is not, will they not get the AWACS if they don't behave, but what will they ask for next? They asked for the F-15s. We said, okay, but no enhancements. Now they've got the enhancements. They've got a bunch of missiles. They've got the territory. And when you get to East Jerusalem, that's a different kind of territory. What Karen says may be watered down strikes some of us as entirely water already. That is, it's like the Saudi peace plan is like the Holy Roman Empire, which was neither Holy Roman nor an empire. This doesn't look Saudi. It looks strangely like the PLO.
George.
That's right. And it also looks like something Kosygin submitted to us as long ago as 1967. It doesn't look as though they have peace in mind, but you can construe this as the slow motion destruction of Israel. And it's not a plan, it's a series of demands about the very things that should be negotiated.
There is a difference here, though.
Moynihan used the phrase, he said that Libya has to learn that there are standards in the world. Well, there really aren't standards in the world. About 50 years ago, David, a senior American official, I believe it was the Secretary of State, objected to our breaking the codes of other nations to read their dispatches on the grounds, he said, that gentlemen do not read other gentlemen's mail. Well, there's a lot of progress, so-called, since then, and now we not only read each other's mail, we shoot the senders. And it's a pretty disagreeable world, and this whole episode comes, some people in this country, schooled in cynicism, say it is suspiciously coincidental that it comes just as the president has signed off on an executive order concerning the CIA. But it does, I think, the lesson I choose to draw from it is that the rehabilitation of the CIA, to which Senator Moynihan referred, comes not a moment too soon. We had the Secretary of State, and at the end of the interview, we asked him, can the United States be taken seriously as a great power if it can't police its own backyard in Nicaragua? You surely could make the same statement here about the entire Western world. Can the Western world be taken seriously in its rhetoric about terrorism and indeed in its determination to survive if a mad dog on the streets of the world, such as Gaddafi, is allowed to go on like this? I mean, Gaddafi has a point. His single point is, little Libya. Why are you people so bothered by this? Well, we're bothered by it for good reasons, but why are we not disciplining Libya? Well, let's go back to the previous administration, which appeased Libya by... I thought I'd heard that. Do it, because they're using the pedigree for our difficulties, and the pedigree goes back there. We withdrew, to appease the Libyans, our naval exercises from the Gulf of Sidra. It was the returning of them there that caused the incident there in August. When they burned our mission, shortly thereafter, we called in their representative in Washington and asked them to use their good offices. Rather than being indignant, rather than disciplining them, we asked them to use their good offices in the hostage presses.
So it seems to me we have a long record, and we're again that these bills are beginning to come due. We do. How about a message, short, cryptic message with, again, a pedigree in American history? Reagan alive or Gaddafi dead? Refer to Japan with reason as Japan Incorporated. They have a degree of intermingling and cooperation between the public and private sectors that we don't have. Too often, particularly in recent years in the United States, the government has been the adversary of the private sector, or perceived that way by our private sector, and they feel they're competing not just with Japanese firms similarly disciplined by market forces, but rather are competing with Japanese governments, Japanese nationalized banks, if you will.
He may, and I may have in mind, he may be treating this as the end of the response. I don't think so. I think this is phase one. Were this the end of the response, it would be highly, disastrously inadequate. It's not the end of the response. Yes, you have to live with the Soviet Union. You do not have to feed them. You do not have to give them cheap loans. You do not have to lay pipelines and buy their natural gas. You do not have to build their tractors. Therefore, there are big many things you can do, and I think the President is, by his remarks this week, committed to doing that. That is, by not only blame the Soviet Union, he sent a letter to Brezhnev. Brezhnev, it seems to me, is bound to reject the letter as an impertinence and interfering in Poland's internal affairs and all that standard other. After has already said, of course, after he's done so, the President is committed to other political and economic actions, some of which will be, I think, quite painful and substantial. It's under the pressure from the German government, puts on détente and East politics and all that, pressured them into piling up an enormous amount of Polish paper. But the United States has a tremendous lever there. What they do with the Germans privately and say that we are about to, unless you do the following cooperative thing, declare the Polish loans a default. Were we to do that, the Germans would have to scramble, like everyone else, to get in the creditor's line. They don't want to do that. So a price for our restraint on declaring Poland in default should be restraint on the part of the Germans in, for example, with the Soviet gas pipeline. I don't think it's to do with not it, but let me stick with what you're saying. I think it would be an unfair characterization of the President's attitude, but I think you're absolutely right. That there is a substantial body of public and semi-private opinion in the Western world that thinks exactly what country as well. The great remaining pressure for détente, classically conceived, comes from large commercial interests. Agribusiness, Caterpillar, International Harvester, all these people selling things to the Soviet Union. That's the great irony. To which you had 26 billion invested. I think the Guardian, for example, in London has already expressed approval. They have already criticized. They've even briefed trade unionists to their eternal disgrace. They criticized Walesa for, as they say, going too far. Furthermore, we have already heard the phrase out of Germany, which is so heavily indebted to the use of the General Gorolewski's experiment. Now, I mean, really, talk about semantic conscription. No, when they had the summit, that particularly smarmy summit in San Clemente, when Brezhnev showed up, and they had a wonderful seance out there with lots of conservative Orange County businessmen went down there, and someone noted the irony and said, what are all you vigorous anti-communist capitalists doing here, dining and sipping cocktails with this man? And one of them said, you don't shoot your customer. The CIA and to domestic spying, which I think is something you had better watch. We have the Attorney General of the United States demanding that federal judges bend to what he calls the conservative tide. You have got a situation where they are trying to wipe out in all effects the Freedom of Information Act. The way you keep your freedom is to stop these little pieces of it. It's chicken little, isn't such a preposterous analysis of the world. Look, the Attorney General said that in fact, courts ought to recur to the constitutional limits of their branch of government a little more often if that threatens you, my goodness. The CIA has not been a rogue elephant. We can live with the CIA. We can't live with some of the so-called regulators. Charles is saying there's CIA under a charter. We have congressional under the one the president signed. It's not a statutory charter, but some things shouldn't be statutory. You have oversight committees of Congress. Are you saying that the oversight committees of Congress are so lax in worrying about Rowan's rights that you're in jeopardy? No. That Americans should fear in 1982. The 99th would be getting hit by the Goodyear blimp, and the 98th would be college presidents, and the 97th would be the CIA.
Assets, which would make possible a more sensible diplomatic and political response, if we summon the will. There are real reasons to doubt whether this administration, and frankly any Republican administration, can summon the kidney to take the steps necessary. Secretary of State Haig is Secretary of State, is that President Reagan came to town and there was a fear that the Europeans didn't know him, didn't trust him, and therefore you needed a Secretary of State known and liked in Europe. However, it could be a year into this that we have a new dangerous phenomenon, that is a Secretary of State whose primary, indeed his only constituency is in Europe, and that gives him an incentive to placate the Allies. The problem that Republican administrations have, particularly in living up to Republican rhetoric. In the first place, they are the party, like it or not, of certain large corporate interests who have a great stake in East-West trade. The president, for general free trade, free market, less government attitudes, is against conscription, which is one of the things the Europeans are always throwing back at us, which is that they at least conscript their young men. So there is a sense in which an administration so reluctant to interfere politically and economically with free trade and small government and all this disarms itself of all the tools other than military tools. Well, the complaint against the Reagan administration is that it talks tough and mocks its own talk by its inaction. If a week from now we gather here, David, and no action has been taken to back up the blaming of the Soviet Union, then I think Harding is vindicated. That, although I agree that we'll do that will stop the pipeline. The way to stop the pipeline is to bring pressure on the Germans. The way to do that is to tell them that unless they stop it, we will call the Polish debt into default, causing a scramble to get in line for the creditors and causing havoc in the German economy. The 64 convention, when Goldwater campaigned hard as a Goldwaterite for the nomination, got up to give his acceptance speech, and everyone said, how will he run? And he turned on a pure Goldwater speech, and someone in the press corps leaned back and said, my God, Goldwater is going to run as Goldwater. Reagan is a Reaganite. And 7 years from now, as he's perhaps finishing a second term, people will still be amazed. That's the case. And you can talk about it now, but you can't do anything more about it except wait and see what happens. People are saying the president is changing the subject. I should have thought that's almost a definition of leadership, as you try and set the agenda of public debate. But again, we're missing the drama of this. James Q. Wilson, a terrific Harvard political scientist, makes the point that there's a natural dynamic in politics, in campaigning particularly, to turn government into an addition machine. Got this program, we'll add this much to government. President Reagan's the first president in 40 years who's trying to put a subtract button on the adding machine. And that goes against the whole dynamic of our politics. And if Americans can't get interested in that, I don't know what they can get interested in. That's right, because the great consumers of transfer payments, which is the big growing portion of the budget, are the elderly. And the elderly are a larger percentage of the population than ever before. They're living longer, they're retiring earlier, they're consuming pensions and medical care, and they are incomparably the toughest lobby in Washington. But there's a political... Mondale and the New York Times are criticizing the Reagan administration from the right on Poland. Now, here the president comes forward with a budget that is bound to get everybody but the hard right mad at him in domestic policy. And he's got a foreign policy with regard to Poland that's going to alienate the hard right. Who's going to be left to support them? Good. I don't think this president has ever in his political career had the genuine hard conservative core disaffected. And that seems to me hard to continue with the foreign policy we have, if we can dignify it as that, with regard to Poland, without causing serious fissures in that base that voted for him in no small measure for foreign policy reasons. Not causing war. Walter Mondale is for calling the loans into default. The New York Times is. I mean, the Democrats, sooner or later, are not so comatose that they will not wake up and figure out how to flank Reagan on the right, to do it in the name of opposing idiotic bankers and their profligate loans, and to please an enormous ethnic group, Polish Americans, in the bargain. I don't see how they can pass up that political bargain.
A piece of news that occurred this past week that I absolutely think should not be lost to history. It was an announcement from the Internal Revenue Service that because of budget cuts, they will no longer be able to help people fill out their tax returns, with 4 exceptions listed by Internal Revenue. They are the physically and mentally handicapped, the illiterate, and members of Congress. Thank you all.
What was released really tells us what to think about it, doesn't it? That is, first of all, whoever did this could not have done it from public-spirited motives. This person, whoever did it, should be subject to a hail of dead cats, scorn, and derision for doing, I think, quite serious damage to the process of government for just the reasons you're given. But I would disagree with what I take to be certainly Sam's position on the Post. I do not think it is the Post's job to discipline the State Department. However, the Post is run by American citizens who have surely the interest of their country at heart, and they are big enough boys and girls to understand that you need to have the capacity for confidentiality in government, and to produce something that amounts only to journalistic voyeurism, and to do it on page one with an implied crowing about how proud they are. What journalistic values do they have, other than if we can lay our hot hands on it, shove it into print as fast as possible?
That, unfortunately,
an enormous yawning vacuum where you want to have a principle. I'm not talking about censorship. I'm talking about good judgment, good citizenship, and a sense of professional ethics. That the fundamental First Amendment freedom consists in not having any noticeable standards.
All right, in the Haig notes, the same thing. The government, not
an analogy here with the judicial process. That is, some evidence comes so tainted by the way we get it that we simply do not want to have a process that includes it. We exclude the evidence because we don't like how it was got.
Horse feathers.
When you want to run a government, you want to run a society with certain minimal civilities within government that you can say, we want to get the news, but there are some rules that even we grand, mighty journalists have to abide by.
You mean gentlemen don't
this country helping neighborhoods in Cleveland. And along people come who are terribly fastidious about the number of countries. I guess there's 6 or 7 that would satisfy some of these people in the whole world who have human rights policies good enough for us to associate with. And then they come along and say we must work for a reconciliation of the people divided in this civil war. We had a civil war in this country, and we had a reconciliation. But between the war and the reconciliation, there occurred appomattox. One side had to win. And in this case, in the United States, it was the central government. And I do not know, could someone tell me what model these people point to? Where around the world have you had a bloody, long, fratricidal civil war with outside involvement that suddenly ended with democratic civilities and a coalition government? Colony fighting a foreign power. If Americans think military aid to Central America is expensive, wait till the governments down there begin to fall and the boat people begin arriving on the coasts of Louisiana and Florida. They'll tell you down there already something about the expense of having this kind of dislocation down there.
But we have
cosmetic changes. I agree that more needs to be done to explain to the American people the realities they do not want to think about, which involve the necessity of the defense increases that the president is going to be hard put to hold. But I really do believe that this country has an extraordinary economic problem it has not begun to understand. We have a budget today that is getting more vicious by the hour, vicious in the sense that the same dynamic of deflation is driving down revenues while it's driving up outlays, to the point that we can look not at a $100 billion deficit, which is a curling hair at the moment in Washington, but within 2 more fiscal years at $200 billion deficits, unless we raise some revenues. Now, when I say that, John Lofton's going to fall over dead and anoint me a non-Reaganite, which is one of the perils of life in Washington. But nevertheless, whether or not the president likes it, his budget was stillborn, and the drama now in the spring of 1982 is going to be how the president compromises, whether he shapes the compromise or is shaped by it.
Is that
he would have been better off had he been clear that this country has no appetite for anything called intervention. Certainly with American troops, and because it is thought there's a slippery slope in this, even with American aid. Whether or not that means the United States is essentially defenseless against subversion around the world is another matter.
Well, it's okay. I thought backing away.
It is kaput when combined with what a number of people, myself emphatically included, consider a feeble response to the suppression of Poland. I think Haig points to an interesting problem that has to be resolved sooner or later, and that is the conflict in government between intelligence services and those with a political, public opinion molding mission. The intelligence services naturally want to protect their sources, and therefore they are reluctant to make public evidence they have from which they feel their sources might be compromised or their intelligence gathering further complicated. I understand their intent to protect their mission, but the political dimension of government that has to bring the public along with it has to override them on occasion and get that evidence out, put up or shut up.
So there is evidence.
Absolutely.
Why haven't they, aside from that reason? Why?
The fact clear.
Could it be that it doesn't exist?
It's possible, but I resist that because, A, I don't think the government is run by a conspiracy of pathological liars, and second, it seems to me that no one disputes, for example, the presence in Nicaragua of 4,000 Cubans, 2,000 of them military.
But you know,
If you will, I think you'll have to. I think the budget today is technically vicious. That is, economic forces, a sharp contraction, are driving revenues down and driving outlays up. And you simply can't exist with this. The balanced budget belief is the glue that holds his party together, and they'll crack and run.
Well,
yes, I know has seen some of these on local Washington television at about 6 or 6:30 in the evening. He saw one recently of a man in a wheelchair with his wife crying next to him who complained that he had been cut off disability. The president the next morning got on the telephone, stirred up his people, said, find that man, an injustice has been committed. They came back and said, well, Mr. President, the story is he was cut off in 1980 when Mr. Carter was president, and he was cut off because he had a full-time job. So the president is convinced, and I think some other people are, that television in its appetite for vivid footage on this subject is not always as discriminating as it might be.
Well, I think
we're all for Nancy Kissinger. The purpose of law, presumably, is to eliminate the need for violent self-help in a civilized society. Our law, because we have made a fetish of First Amendment rights in airports with lunatics accosting travelers, has made it necessary for Nancy Kissinger to do us all a tremendous service. Well, the condor in California is an endangered species. We finally got one. It's a big one. Yeah, big, ugly bird, but one that we want to preserve. And it laid one egg that we know of in 1982. The mother and the father got to fighting over who would sit on it and knocked it off a ledge and broke it. And I'm not surprised it's endangered.
Maybe that's how it came to be endangered.
That's right.
Observation was that the administration did not give the proper appearance, did not seem to be, and I think that's quite possible. But that's in part because I think appearances are not properly construed. The last administration, the Carter administration, invested more passion, public and private, in the subject of arms control than any administration, I think, in modern times, certainly in the nuclear age. The result of that was an arms control agreement that could not be passed through a democratically controlled Senate. So it does seem to me that the gap between public posture and effective negotiations was yawning at that point and may indeed be closed by this administration. Less spectacular and flamboyant in advertising its good intentions, but more effective. I'm not sure what he concedes or thinks he's conceding or is in fact conceding by suggesting that we negotiate about Nicaragua and El Salvador with Cuba. Is he conceding that Cuba is an active party in the conflict? I would think that's a reasonable inference from his proposal. But if you believe, as I do, that Cuba is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Soviet Union, you don't want to start negotiating with them unless you're prepared to embrace the principle that in the settlement of regional disputes in Central America, the Soviet Union's an active participant. And I think that would be a bad principle to affirm. Middleman and talk to Moscow, because I do not credit the Cuban government, which is auctioning off its young men to pay its foreign debts to the Soviet Union. I do not credit them with an independent will. Necessarily, it depends on who you're negotiating with, and I don't want to leave the impression that I'm for negotiating with Moscow either on Central America. The reasons you just gave, all of which are good, and there's another one to add to it, and that is...
Reasons they gave, or did I quote it?
I would not want to credit you with those reasons, Haig. But also the fact that they're coming from the Congress, and indeed 161 communities in Vermont at their town meetings adopted foreign policies now, a strategic arms negotiating position, demonstrates the asymmetry between the United States and the Soviet Union in negotiating. That is, we have domestic pressures which can be counted upon to, if not paralyze, at least restrain our procurement and deployment processes, whereas the Soviet Union has no such pressure welling up within it. I would add that reason as to why you should, a proposed freeze, which the most you're apt to get out of this, Vermont not only cannot in its town meetings control the Congress and the executive branch of the United States, it has precious little influence in Red Square. The most it can do is complicate the process of matching the Soviet arms race on our part, and will have no restraining effect. Start at town meetings and in state referenda, such as the one you're going to have in California, I guess, in June, and I have perhaps in 6 other states by now. When you start spelling out through bumper stickers and placards and 30-second commercials on television strategic arms negotiating positions, you are not elevating the conduct of American government.
Identity on anything, for God's sake.
Discover that war is hell and nuclear war is the most hellish of all.
A long time ago, and I've been saying this a long time, and I wonder where my fellow Republicans and conservatives have been, that they don't try some such initiative.
But are you suggesting, and this seems to be the poisonous tinge to this kind of argument, are you suggesting that those who disagree with a particular formulation for addressing this problem are somehow ignorant of or indifferent to the prospect of being incinerated? The treaty did not do it in the hope that it would bring Armageddon closer, but because we thought it was a threat to stable deterrence.
I argued against it also, if you recall.
To me, it was.
In the 1970s, when the Soviet Union undertook an enormous arms buildup, we had, in effect, some people say, a freeze. That is, except for the Trident submarine now just coming on stream, throughout the 1970s, we didn't deploy a single new ICBM or a single new submarine-launched ballistic missile. Why do you think that in the 1980s, another, in fact, an extension of the American freeze would get a better response from the Soviet Union than it did then? I think resolution you make a nod to, and I take it you mean it seriously, verification. Of course. What plans do you have? If you're going to freeze at a numerical level of launchers and missiles and all that, how are you going to verify increases in throw weights of missiles, increases in the yields of warheads, increases in cruise missiles, and we can't even tell whether they're range or whether they're nuclear or conventional cruise missiles?
First of all,
it's verification of the sort of things I'm talking about.
Exactly.
You say that your resolution should be null and void.
Well, there
magic phrases look at. They're willing to look at entitlements. They're willing to look at the defense budget. They're willing to look at tax increases. But basically, the party that's supposed to be brimming over with new ideas didn't brim over in ABC studio this morning, I didn't think.
And Bob,
in the case that the Reagan budget calls for a substantial increase in the percentage of gross national product spent by the federal government, a substantial increase over the Carter budget. So he hasn't even made a significant slowing of the rate of growth of the federal government yet. So it's a little hard to cry pain and torture as a result of the Reagan budget as it applies to domestic programs. It's an old rule of sports and politics. You can't beat something with nothing, and the only game on the table right now is Ronald Reagan's. But a good many of the most conspicuous public leaders of this particular movement for the nuclear freeze are the people who lost 44 states last year. That is, they're senior officials from the previous administration.
Well, now wait a second.
What we know about the shaping of public opinion on arms control issues is that, for example, the American people are extremely sensitive to the question of verification. And none of the things that this depends on can, it seems to me, be verified under current technology by national means or by a more forthcoming attitude by the Soviet Union.
Isn't that with that?
I should think they'd leap at the opportunity. It's the United States saying, why don't you come in and become a mediator of conflict in our own backyard? I've not seen the Russians inviting us to come in and mediate the problems they have in Eastern Europe.
I think it's just, what's the alternative?
The alternative is, as I've said before, it seems to me one side or another has to win an armed conflict that's going on in Central America. You can't get out of this on the cheap. You can't buy off the Cubans. And you can, I suppose, end it by simply bringing the Soviet Union in to turn the Monroe Doctrine inside out and become a partner in settling our affairs. I don't know what the State Department means by globalizing this. Either it means we're going to insist on linkage, which will cause the Soviet Union to crack a rib laughing, if the people who have continued with all the business as usual during Poland are going to suddenly invoke linkage, or it means the Soviet Union will become a partner in allocating authority in Central America, which is appalling.
I think
those State Department verbs that you can't conjugate, to globalize, I haven't the slightest idea what it means. And that may indeed be,
I think it means to turn it in.
More than sending helicopter gunships to legitimate regimes currently being undermined.
All right.
These nuclear arms negotiations. You said et tu, side.
Well,
what do you mean?
I don't know quite what side he's complaining about. He wants us to talk about the Brezhnev proposal. It's not new, as you suggested at the outset. It was made first in 1979 and repeated ever since. It is the Soviets' negotiating position in Geneva, where we are talking about it right now through Paul Nitze. Let's make clear what the proposal is, if you will permit just two numbers, guys.
Only two.
All right.
Only two.
Brezhnev says we like the situation where we shall have 300 intermediate range missiles, you shall have 0, and we shall be unlimited east of the Urals, where we can put mobile missiles that even not moved can hit Europe. Now that's the proposal we're supposed to rush out and talk about, and indeed we do. You think we're doing in Geneva? This is the point. Ronald Reagan is doing everything people want, and they keep saying, why don't you do it?
Well, they've done negotiations have just been. Read the world press on it. They think it's
our allies, even our allies, and I stress, even our allies recognized it as a tired, shot proposal on the table. He unveiled it in November. It's called the zero option. He beat Brezhnev to the punch. Why are...
Forget it, Joe.
Forget it. Why
forget it? You know, George, it's always a question of who.
This is the classic American asymmetry. We put something on the table, the Soviet Union sits there, and the Kilpatricks of the world say it's not working, let's move toward the Soviet Union. Well, I wonder if we wind up
let's get something going with our start. We're not going anywhere with start. No, it just goes back and forth.
There is one difference, and that is that we had a virtual freeze throughout the 1970s, when we didn't deploy an SLBM, when we moved a few, but didn't deploy any ICBMs. Yes. We had a unilateral freeze, didn't drive the Soviet Union to moderation by the power of our good example. Let's not ignore the fact that the presence of television cameras in a war zone or a democracy has consequences for foreign policy. The first war this country lost was the first living room war, the first war that made war vivid.
You mean Korea?
No, I don't think we lost the Korean War. We lost in Vietnam. We achieved our stated goal in Korea, which was to restore the 38th parallel. That's another matter. I believe that if there had been television cameras at Gettysburg, this would be two nations today. The country wouldn't have put up with the carnage. And it's a nice question whether or not democracies have the kidney for the reality of war, or whether, avoiding the reality of war, they will have a foreign policy that simply is untenable.
Maybe the reality of war will help eventually.
Has the same power on public opinion in Moscow, yes. American people are less deferential toward established authority in general. Get that way as the years go by. Therefore, I would expect the next president to decline even faster in the polls, because to govern is to choose is to help some people, but to hurt others. The West Bank can remain a Jewish state, given the demographic facts about whose population is growing faster. If they're going to absorb 600,000 Palestinians reluctantly, they can't remain a Jewish state. I believe, I don't know whether Jody feels the same way, but the autonomy provisions have been non-starters from the start. That is, you either negotiate too much autonomy, in which case you have a Palestinian state carved into the back of Israel where it's 8 miles wide, or you have too little, you have dissatisfaction, you remain an occupying power, and you have an Ulster in the Middle East. There's no solution short of getting the king out of his castle in Jordan, recent guest on this show, and getting him involved in negotiating what he insists is his land. But whether or not they put an Israeli civil law as opposed to military law, which is all they did on the Golan Heights, seems to me irrelevant. The Golan Heights...
They already had the military presence.
Whether or not you want the law administered by the civil or the military power is not a matter of great constitutional dimension. Juridically, the land in dispute is part of the unallocated Palestine mandate to be settled by negotiations between the parties directly concerned. You can't do it without the king of Jordan.
It was Jordan's land in the 67 war.
But Jordan captured it by strength of arms in 1947 and 48, and that did not settle juridically the status of that land.
So 2 wrong.
In 7 Americans is a Social Security beneficiary. 1 in 6 Americans who works off the farm works for government in some way or another. I just do not believe that when the time comes to actually vote, you're going to find 3 people in Congress who are ready to cap cost of living increases or public employees' pay raises. And yet, wants to annoy the elderly. 16% of those who voted in 1980 were 65 years old or older. All public employees, teachers, and all of that, to cut the budget, the deficit from, say, 180 billion to 120 billion. You don't get credit for that.
And I don't know what he said. Maybe you know. How do you say?
He should have said, I took the wrong plane and I'm going home. It was a terrible mistake going down there. It's not just turning the Monroe Doctrine inside out, it's driving a stake through it, because he went down to negotiate with a paid employee of the Soviet Union, a wholly owned subsidiary. And the Reagan administration has no business, surely, dragging them into a mediator's role in this hemisphere. So I think it's clearly a mark of a civilized society that it recognizes diminished competence as a defense in a criminal case. The question is whether or not we have elaborated our medical models and opened a kind of open-ended process of ascertaining and deciding the burden of proof with regard to insanity, and whether or not we have to go back to a simpler rule as to whether or not the person could appreciate the nature and quality of his act. It also is arguable, Ted, that because there's a certain indeterminateness built into the scientific, quasi-scientific, or pseudo-scientific determination of insanity in cases like this, that the insanity plea should be dropped from the trial part and brought in only as a dispositional matter, that is, at the sentencing procedure. Use the trial to assign to a particular actor the responsibility for the act, and then determine the extent to which indeed he was responsible later. Well, there is a sense in which in criminal law the perfect has become the enemy of the good. The courts have elaborated, for a lot of interesting reasons perhaps, the Miranda restraints, the exclusionary rule. But that clearly doesn't apply in this case. You know, there's a lot to be said in a case like this, Ted, where an extremely famous person is attacked by someone who instantly becomes extremely famous, that we should have delay in order to avoid the passions of the moment from intruding upon what should be a dispassionate process. But more or less, I don't think at any rate that I'd draw large social lessons from an obviously peculiar case. I do think, looking back at the larger principle of the law,
It may be that a liberal society begins to feel guilty about the very process of punishing anyone, of assigning responsibility, because we believe not just that when a young man shoots a president at broad daylight in front of television cameras that there's an assumption that he's peculiar and in some way deranged, but we begin to think that all deviant behavior is abnormal, and we define all sin as sickness, not believing anymore in evil itself. And therefore, the whole notion of responsibility and hence of punishment becomes very attenuated indeed.
Is their arms straight?
He is correct, in fact, and correct to have said so. Well, there come points, and we're at one now, when a president must choose between not speaking the truth and thereby keeping our allies tranquil and telling a rallying and informing truth to his own people. The president did the latter, and he told the truth. It was your factual assertion that practically everyone disagrees with the president. I think honorable men and women of goodwill disagree on this point. The president is on one side. Well, I know you listed a number. It's a larger universe than that. I talked at length, for example, with Henry Jackson this morning, and I think his principal objection to what the president said is that it is alarming to our allies, and not least of all to a nation not our ally, the Chinese. But that's another matter. It does seem to me this is something about which people can disagree, and the president has his position, and I agree in terms of throw weight, in terms of hard target warheads, in terms of submarines, in terms of theater imbalances in a place such as Europe, the president is correct. Be tragic. It was said in 1972, at the time of the SALT I agreement, that we then had essential equivalence. I do not see how you can say we had it then and have it still today, given the immeasurable shifts that have occurred. As a matter of policy, was flatly opposed to even negotiating about defensive systems until, by one vote, the Senate of the United States in 1969 or 70, I forgot which, passed the ABM authorization. At that point, the Soviet Union reversed itself on a dime and negotiated a limit on ABMs. And I think that is probably a paradigm of how this works. It seems to me you have an awful choice once you get behind, if I may emphasize that.
We cannot accept your assumption that we are behind.
Right, now we've heard
okay.
Now we go on. Either, if we're behind, as I assert, then we either have to ask the Soviet Union to take something off the boards or to hold still while we catch up. You get in this awful dilemma that Elizabeth was just talking about. Now, it seems to me...
You think they will hold still while we catch up?
I don't know, but I think we're going to find out. We can certainly afford to compete with them, as I do not think we've adequately done for a decade.